Thank you all for signing in to learn about our tall terraces as an adaptation of sea level rise. I'm really excited to tell y'all some of our results of the recent work. My co-authors are Lindsay Nakashima and Timmy Vincent. Yeah, most of y'all know me, Audubon, but if you don't, National Audubon Society is not just an organization that focuses on birds, but is also a conservation organization that focuses on the habitats that birds need to survive and thrive. And what helps birds helps other wildlife and ultimately us. Okay, let's see if it's going to work for me, Eric. There we go. Audubon owns land in the form of sanctuaries, and its largest and oldest sanctuary happens to be in Louisiana. The Paul J. Rainey Wildlife Sanctuary is 26,000 acres, was donated in 1924, and has almost a century of land management by Audubon in Vermilion Parish in southwest Louisiana. Along the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, critical coastal habitat necessary for the survival of many birds of concern, wildlife, and area fisheries is disappearing at an alarming rate, and this rate is forecasted to increase as the climate warms and the sea level rises. And as a landowner, Audubon is concerned with coastal issues as well, and we're vested in experimenting with conservation practices that have merit on our own land and to share the results with others. We believe that every acre of diverse habitat that can be created, restored, or enhanced to provide a sustainable refuge will increase the resiliency of fish and wildlife populations in a changing climate. The primary threats to Louisiana coastal area are rising water and increasing storms. There are the other things, but that's what I consider primary. In 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projected that sea level rise will increase by 15 to 36 inches by the year 2100 and reach 7 to 16 feet by 2300. This slide came from that report and shows the main drivers of this sea level rise on the left. As the world warms, melting ice in Greenland, in the Antarctic, and from glaciers around the world will increase the volume of water in the oceans. The orange shaded area on the right is the worst case scenario if the world does nothing with business as usual, and the blue shaded area is the best case scenario if corrective measures are implemented immediately. We all know that reality will be somewhere in between these two areas. However, sea level rise is not globally uniform, and in Louisiana, this is made worse by varying amounts of coastwide subsidence or the land sinking. So as the sea level rises, increasing storms fed by warmer temperatures will have more severe impacts on the remaining landscape, and storm effects will reach further inland. The good news is that marshes still develop and thrive between high and low tides around the world and are documented to keep up with the slow rise in mean water levels with input of sediment and or time to generate organic substrates. However, in the marshes of Louisiana, because of land sinking and water rising at an increasingly rapid rate, or saltwater intrusion killing marsh and dissolving organics, and not enough sediment being brought in by overbank floods or rivers, many marshes are being overwhelmed, undermined, and drowned. Levees, spoil banks, and natural ridges are often the only land features left in the landscape. These features become critical habitat for remaining wildlife. But humans are not known for allowing nature to take its course, and terracing is one of the tools used in South Louisiana to address marsh loss. If you search the internet for the word terrace, these are the types of results you will find. Terraces have been constructed since prehistoric times for terrestrial or agricultural purposes, basically to slow water runoff, channel water flow, conserve and settle soil, and to moderate moisture content. Breakwaters also have been constructed since prehistoric times to protect a harbor, settlement, or shoreline from water waves and to prevent shoreline erosion. So in Louisiana in the 1990s, the combination of these two proven structures was transferred to an aquatic use, wetland conservation, by placing linear earthen constructions within shallow open water areas of interior marsh. These marsh terraces were expected to function like a breakwater to break up fetch and protect the fragile marsh shoreline from water waves, and like a terrestrial terrace to slow water movement and conserve and settle sediment. The first actual terraces I could document in some of my research were in 1994 in Cameron Parish, west of Calcasieu Lake, And the purpose in the permit was, I quote, to create islands and deep water areas for fish and wildlife during periods of flood and drought. So it's not really a new idea. By 1997, there were several permits for marsh terraces. Even so, most terraces are built no taller than 3 feet above sea level and expected to settle to marsh level. This makes these habitats and wildlife that depend on them at risk from high water events today, and at that elevation will soon be swamped by rising seas and subsiding land. Now in the marshes of South Louisiana, shiners and other natural ridges or levees topped with trees serve as a particularly critical habitat for wildlife such as migratory songbirds and others that must cope with the increasing streams and water level and storm energy. These ridges are rarely submerged or overwashed. They're difficult to erode and form a ramp for habitat succession to move up as the water rises. However, their linear nature encourages predation by invasive bobcat and coyote on ground and shrub nesting species. I could probably add hogs in with this. So once again in Louisiana, two ideas were combined to incorporate the benefits of both to increase the resiliency of wetland landscape, provide multiple habitat benefits, and discourage predation. At Audubon's Paul J. Rainey Wildlife Sanctuary in Southwest Louisiana, we're taking marsh terraces literally to the next level by doubling the elevation from 3 feet to 5 to 6 feet above sea level and adding trees to address the long-term or greater than 50-year sea level rise projection. Taller terraces will improve the functionality and resiliency of the wetlands, while also providing diversified habitat for fish and wildlife as the climate changes, tidal influences increase, and sea level rises. Taller terraces should persist longer in the landscape, and even if or when partially submerged, will continue to serve as a buffer to water flow, wind energy, and wave erosion to the maximum predicted height of sea level of about 36 inches by the year 2100, or for at least the next 80 years. And it's hoped that discontinuous ridges that are surrounded by water and by deep water on either side will discourage incursion by terrestrial predators. I don't know of other terraces that are attempted this high. Some are 4 feet, and there's a variety out there. But there are challenges to building taller terraces, and that might be why. Traditional terraces are built to marsh height as the most cost-effective configuration and the easiest to permit in order to bring benefits by the mere fact of breaking the surface of the water. Our goal to create taller, more robust, and durable configurations required more cubic yards of material for construction, and this not only affects the cost, but affects the amount of bottom disturbance during excavation, increases the weight of the material that can cause deformation of the pre-existing water bottom and can cause slope failures, and poses difficulties in coastal use permitting for any new land above marsh level. But all of these can be addressed. However, terrace ridges can't be just put anywhere. Just like a marsh terrace, there are certain parameters necessary to a successful project, and some of these include location, substrate, design, and configuration. Terracing is more cost-effective and successful in shallow water because less material is needed in a shallow system just to break the surface of the water. And fetch, therefore, wave energy is reduced by shortening the distance to the next landform, which can be the surrounding marsh in a small water body or another terrace in a larger body of water. Substrate, or the water bottom, must be able to support the weight of the overlying construction materials, and the building material must be of a consistency that will stack or stay in place without undue side displacement or slippage over the previous layer. The character of the substrate and building material will determine how or even if a terrace can be constructed. The best way to find out these things is through a geotechnical analysis. A geotech report will be required for the permit, but it's even more important when you're designing project elements and trying to predict performance. A geotech report provides such things as expected stackability, settlement rates that may indicate a need for overbuilding or building taller because you know it's going to settle lower. It'll indicate bottom stability or how much it may sink with the weight on top of it. And it may provide other parameters that can influence the outcome of construction and therefore influence the construction design and timeline for the best chance of success. A geotechnical analysis may be available from a nearby project, but if there are none nearby, or if you don't know of any nearby, you can contact Louisiana Department of Natural Resources for assistance, or ultimately expect to pay for a geotech report from an engineering company. For our project, we used a geotech report from the Coles Bayou Quipper project that was just to the north of our project. It indicated that we had good material interspersed with slippery organics. We expected to have the terraces constructed in lifts or layers to allow the material to settle and become more stable before adding the next layer. And we were aware that the 6-foot height might be difficult to achieve. As I mentioned earlier, earthen terraces have been used in Louisiana interior marshes since the 1990s with varying configurations, different materials, and varying levels of success. Fortunately, most of these required a coastal use permit, which include design drawings that are publicly accessible. And this comes in very handy if you're looking for ideas on project design and what was successfully permitted in the past. This information can be found by searching the LDNR Sunrise database, or more easily by using Audubon's Tigger application, which lets you find the same database by locating your area on a map. You just search the internet using either one of these acronyms, and you'll find the links. So that's what we did. This is an example of a typical design for terraces adjacent to our property. For the terrace design at Rainey, that plat format on the previous slide was copied and the information was adapted to fit our landscape and our project. In our case, it was to increase the elevation to 6 feet instead of 3.5 feet. And to allow habitats to move up as the water rises, we chose a gentle side slope of 1 to 5, or 1 foot up for every 5 feet across the ground. This also provided a wider marsh and grass fringe than the steeper slopes, which we hope will buffer erosional wave energy and reduce edge erosion, helping the terrace persist for even longer. Based on measurements of the surrounding levees for minimum configuration for where the trees grew, we expanded the crest of our terrace design to a 30-foot width with an expectation of planting trees 25 feet apart. Our target area at Rainey was a water management unit we call Deep Lake that's been severely fragmented by Hurricane Rita in 2005 and Ike in 2008. All that open marsh was solid before then. Because coastal permitting discourages disturbing existing marsh or connecting to existing marsh, we identified open water areas that would accommodate the width of the planned design, including the associated borrow areas. All of our terraces were roughly about 500 feet long. The terraces were placed at an angle perpendicular to the most damaging predominant winds. And in South Louisiana, the predominant winds are from a northerly component in the winter and from a southerly component in the summer. But in many shallow water systems like ours that have a tidal connection, the summer south winds are actually more damaging, since the winter north winds usually force the water out of the system before waves can form. We set ours roughly at 60 degrees by the compass, or 30 degrees from equator parallel, to be hurricane ready against our damaging winds that come generally from the southeast with tropical storms. In the Louisiana coastal zone, any project that moves sediment or alters water flow is required to obtain a coastal use permit from the LDNR Office of Coastal Management and the Corps of Engineers before the project can be constructed. This system was established to protect the critically important wetland environment from unnecessary damage and to guide development and the use of best practices to minimize impacts. There's a checklist online for all of the information that's required in order to submit a permit application, but I'm not going to go into all the details here. Just know that there's a lot of things that have to be measured and documented for a permit, and the fees depend on the volume of material you plan to move from a public source. It's highly recommended to use to request a pre-application meeting. The Department of Natural Resources organizes the meeting for you with all of the agencies that may have concerns in respect to your project and can help you improve your design or potentially deny your request for a permit. These agencies may include the LDNR Office of Coastal Management, Office of Coastal Management Mitigation, Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, and the NOAA National Marine Fisheries Service. Prior to our meeting, we sent them a document explaining what it was we wanted to do and included the drawings that were intended as part of the permit application. And our discussions included how Audubon planned to minimize damage to the existing marsh, the water bottom, what we might do to submerged aquatic vegetation in the area, and how we meant to control suspended sediments. The most challenging requirements for us, though, was addressing essential fish habitat and the Hydrologic Modification Impact Assessment, or HMIA. The Corps of Engineers will not issue their permit without project approval from the National Marine Fisheries Service, whose focus is to protect fisheries resources. There's a complicated definition for essential fish habitat. Well, let's just consider everything that's covered by water, including marsh, as essential fish habitat. It doesn't matter if it used to be a marsh or a beach. If it's water now at this moment and has the potential to have a minnow in it, it might be considered essential fish habitat by NMFS. So any new area created that's above what a fish can access will be expected to be offset by the creation of new fish habitat, most likely new marsh. The other alternative would be to pay a mitigation fee. For our project, we negotiated a 1-to-2 offset of 1 acre of new marsh to be created for every 2 acres of water bottom that we took away from a fish. Since our terraces would create a marsh fringe, I had NMFS provide the elevation on our design that they thought would become marsh. And this was the area between 6 inches below our normal water level to 1 foot above, or the narrow band of green in the scale drawing. The white and orange represent the area above what a fish could use, and the narrow band of blue is below marsh, so it didn't really count against us. For each of our tall terraces then, about 3/4 of an acre would be above what a fish could use, and 0.18 acres would be marsh fringe. So for each tall terrace, we had to offset a little over 1/2 acre that we took away from fish feet by the creation of a little more than 1/4 acre of new marsh. By converting 2 of our 14 planned terraces to marsh and making 1 of them wider, we were able to meet the required offset to gain NMFS approval. The HMIA was added to the permitting process around 2016 and was new to those of us with experience in permitting, although many of the elements were not new. It just kind of brought them all into one big document. It was put into place to ensure that a proposed coastal use does not adversely affect other properties or waterways by changing the hydrologic conditions. Each project submitted is classified by the amount of environmental change that would result and placed into levels, categories of required response and actions. And it gets, as the levels increase, so does the amount of information and the amount of things you have to do increase. Our project was definitely above the 6 inches above marsh level that put us into level 2, and therefore required a whole list of assurances. They wanted a map showing existing and proposed water flow, something called a design storm event, and how the drainage would be affected, information on topography, slope, drainage patterns, runoff, the effect on adjacent properties, and planned best management practices to lessen suspended sediment impacts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Rather than pay a hydrologist, though, we addressed this by a document that we addressed each point that they requested with data and maps, and put forth every argument we had to show that the pre-construction and post-construction conditions in this more or less flat marsh would be similar, if not improved. Further, DNR Permitting and Mitigation Division was really helpful in helping me modify the document that we created into an HMIA that would be accepted for the coastal permit. That wasn't the end of the permitting challenges, as you can imagine, and our experience may differ greatly from yours. My advice would be to persevere but be flexible. Look for options and keep asking questions. We were very flexible in everything other than reducing the height, and that's the thing they kept trying to get me to do, is reduce the height. But I kept asking for help on how to achieve that goal. And so we did receive our permit by July 2018, about 8 months after our pre-application meeting, which I'm told is rather quick. Just after waterfowl season closed for our adjacent neighbors, we started construction on January 25th, 2019, and we completed the construction on April 3rd of last year. 3 months later, on July 13th, Hurricane Barry made a visit. And after 5 months of settling, we hosted a volunteer marsh planting event in September to stabilize the base. And after 11 months of settling, we planted bare root tree seedlings. Audubon Louisiana is fortunate to have in-house capabilities for design, planning, implementation, and monitoring of small-scale restoration projects. And just FYI, the permit did not require the level of documentation or quality of maps and things that we provided. Hand-drawn maps and designs can work perfectly well. It's the clarity of information is what the agencies will need to understand what you're trying to do. For our project, all placement, planning, and planar measurements were an ARC map based on available 2017 imagery, supplemented with imagery acquired by our DJI Phantom 4 drone. We plotted all the poles that would be needed to mark construction limits of our design in the GIS and uploaded it to a Trimble RTK surveying unit. The various poles were color-coded with paint to match the map. So we had green poles and red marked poles, and then a map for each terrace was given to the contractor. This resulted in 29 poles that had to be surveyed and placed in the field for each terrace to guide the contractor on site. Each pole was placed as accurately as possible using the RTK unit attached to the side of our airboat or mud boat. The target elevation for the terrace crest was marked with red duct tape. You can see it here with a red arrow pointing to it. It was a surprise to see what that 6-foot elevation was going to mean in the landscape. The 14 terraces were constructed by see, it's not going to work right. Hang on. Let me see if I can back up. There we go. The 14 terraces were constructed by 2 marsh buggy excavators, and the height was achieved by multiple lifts or layers. They began January 25th and ended April 3rd of last year. There are many challenges for the contractor trying to stack the material in the time we allowed, and the 6-foot height was rarely achieved. The material was predominantly good, thick clay, stick to your boot clay, but there were layers of organic soil that caused slippage, and stacking above 5 feet sometimes caused the structure to crack and slump under its own weight. The weight of the material pushed down on the existing substrate and sometimes caused softer material to squeeze out horizontally. The result of this was that instead of building higher, material placed on the top would cause the bottom to spread. We were limited by the permit for how much at the bottom we could impact, and decisions were made to accept a lower elevation in these cases. Immediate benefits were seen as soon as the material broke the surface. Wind-generated waves were calmed to ripples behind the structures, and birds swarmed the exposed mud. We were almost constantly resurveying each structure and mapping with the drone to make sure we were getting what we planned. In between lifts, we replaced elevation marks as our carefully placed poles were knocked over or buried. On the left is a drone mosaic that was brought into the GIS with terrace plan overlaid to see if the contractor followed our guide poles appropriately. You can see in this one, he did pretty good. On the right is a plot of the elevations we collected with our RTK unit as soon as the material was consolidated enough to walk on. And we learned rather quickly to wait after sinking hip deep in mud holes. This was sent to the contractor. Both these things were sent to the contractor to either confirm our acceptance of what they've done and designate it complete, or ask them to try again. And this is how the finished terraces look in the landscape in April of 2019. The views to the north-northeast, and for scale, there are boats in the bottom of the image at Deep Lake Canal. The mud is very dark, very wet, very sticky. This slide shows the July 2019 drone imagery overlaid on the base imagery. It took 6 drone missions to map the area at a 400-foot altitude. The wide terrace on the far right was the terrace built to 3 feet for marsh as an offset to essential fish habitat, and the other offset terrace is to the far left. It's number 14. Only 2 of the terrace ridges actually made it to 6 feet. For the others, we declared it complete if any part of the terrace was between 5 and 6 feet. Pre and post-construction bathymetry in the vicinity of each planned terrace was captured by a GPS-linked fathometer system installed on the side of an airboat. The system allowed real-time viewing of the track line on the laptop screen to ensure appropriate coverage during acquisition. And the track line data coverage was sufficient to generate a bathymetric map for the project area, partially shown on the left. The post-construction bathymetric survey of the borrow areas was combined with post-construction drone imagery and with our plan outlines to document changes to the bottom due to the construction activities. This will allow calculations of borrow to fill ratio and as a baseline for any future surveys to see if and how they fill in. I don't have those numbers yet. In May, a month after construction, submerged aquatic vegetation were observed coming up in the usual locations. They're an important indicator of water quality and will be monitored for persistence in any new recruitment. Bright green is yellow banana lily, and the dark green is coontail or hornwort. Incidentally, to the north of the new terraces, and you can see one of the terraces in the bottom left corner, in October, 6 months after construction, the water cleared up in the small dredge marsh restoration site to the north to reveal heavy SAV, submerged aquatic vegetation occurrence. The SAVs are the dark green splotches you can see across the mud brown bottom. This was the densest occurrence of SAVs that we've ever seen in the project site in the 5 years since that area was filled. And this perhaps provides a good example of synergy between conservation projects. New vegetation became obvious also by May after construction in March, April. So just a couple months and plants were popping up. Seeds germinated in the cracks or along rack lines and clumps of marsh that had been left by high water events self-rooted. Remember those deep holes we created on either side of the terrace? There's at least one alligator in each one. The rest of the open water areas are only 1 to 2 feet deep, and they couldn't really hide from you at low water, nor could they cool off in the hot summers. The borrow areas, the deep holes also provide a retreat for other aquatic creatures when the low tide drains the marsh. Birds were using the terrace material as soon as it was shallow enough for them to reach it. Terns and wading birds arrived first, then other birds arrived as the material aged and solidified. Since we'd planned to set aside 2 to 3 terraces as bird islands, we were excited when least terns started nesting in June on 3 of our terraces. They started nesting in April of this year. Then, just a month later, Hurricane Barry made landfall on July 13th, 2019, just 3 months after terrace construction. It passed just east of Rainey, making landfall at Marsh Island, and the east end of Rainey first before making the second landfall east of Intercoastal City. Pre-storm winds pushed the water out, post-storm wind pushed the water in, and one pulse somewhere around midnight brought the water level 4 feet above normal. And we know this because prior to terrace construction, Environmental and Coastal Services, or ENCOS, was kind enough to install a type of water gauge in Deepwater Canal and at 2 other locations in Belle Ile Bayou that captured water level, as well as velocity and many other parameters. And all of this data was provided to us real time online. So in this case, it captured the storm surge for Hurricane Barry through our area. And for reference, I added a line for our normal water level right at 1 foot. It clearly showed the depressed water level before the storm and elevated levels that remained following the passage of the system. The actual storm surge was documented at just under 5 feet, and it moved through our area east to west around midnight on the 13th. A 5-foot storm surge is 4 feet above normal at Rainey and covered the marsh and most of the surrounding levees. It also would have overwashed the local Gulf beaches. In our project area, it overwashed any portion of the terraces below 5 feet. And of course, we were concerned for our least tern babies. We had trail cameras set up on each of the least tern terraces, and one of them provided these before and after images. This is the same spot, and you can see you can see 2 chicks in the top image, 5 days before the storm. The bottom image was the day after landfall and still shows the elevated water level, rain, and high winds. It was several days before we could get out for our storm assessment. You can't see the terraces from the canal, so I flew the drone first and was pleased to find that the terraces still existed. The oblique imagery showed the storm effects that validated our design. The storm forces were from the southeast, as we expected, which is from the left in both of these images. The storm energy removed fine sediment from the south or the left side and deposited it on the north or the right side. And a rack line was stranded at maximum surge height, proving that this terrace was definitely above 5 feet. The marsh behind the terraces were undamaged by wave energy, although rack line included clumps of marsh removed from other parts of the landscape. During the ground survey, we checked for lease turns. Sadly, the first turn colony we checked was completely overwashed with nothing left. Even our camera was drowned. As we approached the other 2 terrace colonies, Timmy spotted movement and we confirmed that at least 2 chicks survived on each one. The chick on the right was running across the terrace. They were camouflaged so well that once they stopped and ducked, I couldn't find them. So there may have been more that we just couldn't see. Checking the trail cams later, we found the image on the left, that's from 2 days after the storm, as if this chick just wanted to make sure he was still there. So the result is just 3 months following construction of our terraces, our taller design to withstand sea level rise and storms was validated. It sheltered marsh and lease turn chicks from a hurricane storm surge. I already showed how new land readily recruits vegetation naturally from the local seed base and waterborne pieces and parts. And in other words, water and wind will bring plants to new dirt. However, best practices recommend planting the fringe with marsh species that already occur in the project area as soon as possible to protect the foot of the terrace. Spartina alterniflora is a general use plant, functions well in many salinities of Louisiana. You can make it fun by organizing a volunteer event like we did. We held a 2-day volunteer event to plant 14,000 marsh plants on our 14 terraces. Woody growth not only protects the surface from rain and wind erosion, but holds a new landform together by more substantial roots than grass and flowers. Again, shrubs will arrive naturally within a year of construction, but planting locally native trees and shrubs of your choice can jumpstart the process and help diversify the habitats. It took 2 days for Rainey staff to plant 330 bare root seedlings, 25 feet apart, on 9 of our 500-foot long terraces. We chose local species of live oak and southern hackberry or sugarberry to start, and we'll add other species later to diversify. We allowed the birds to decide which terraces were most appropriate for their use during the first season following construction. So the 3 terraces that hosted lease turn colonies last year were not planted with trees this year. So I had planned to do a 1-year update, but unfortunately with current affairs, we weren't able to travel for the intended 1-year data until last week. So I have 2020 photos, but I don't have any data to add to what I'm about to tell you. These were in October 2019 after the September marsh planting, and you can see the little sprigs of plant around the perimeter of each one of these islands. The permitting agencies were concerned about the impact the project would have on water qualities and SAVs. That aerial photo documentation we gathered showed that the water and deep lake water management unit began decreasing toward the end of June, which was only about 3 months after construction, but it increased, of course, following the impact of the hurricane in July. By September, the suspended sediments had dropped out again and SAVs increased dramatically by October, which you can see in the picture on the right. Thus, water quality and SAVs were improved after 6 months following excavation of the bottom to construct the tall terraces. This is what I've got for a 1-year update. The photo on the right was just last week. We planted marsh grass 2 months after the photo that's on the left. The marsh grass plantings on the perimeter expanded. The plants colonized the rack line that was left by Hurricane Barry, and the submerged aquatic vegetation have expanded and increased. And I want to show you one more photo set. This is a pre-construction mosaic for kind of the center of Deep Lake. taken in January of 2019 before the terraces were constructed. And you can see how turbid or muddy the water looks because of wave action. And there's not much in the way of SAVs. The current primarily flowed kind of in a little curve right in this direction, if you can see my cursor. And then there was some minor flows coming in through here. So this one is from May 2020, the exact same frame. It was collected actually last Friday by our drone and was just processed into a mosaic yesterday. So it was slightly lower water elevation than the previous image, but you can see how much clearer the water is with less wave action. And you can see how much the submerged aquatics have expanded. That's all the, this area, the dark area, that's all submerged aquatics. You can see how the water flow has adapted to the presence of the terraces, kind of making the water slow down a little bit. I'm starting to think that this is filling in right here. It's just fascinating to watch this stuff. Before I get carried away. According to the geotech report from the nearby Quipper project, 30% of the primary consolidation was expected to occur within the immediate 6 months following construction, 50% by 1 year and 90% in 2 to 4 years. Secondary settlements could develop during the following 8 to 10 years. At the 6-month post-construction time period in October 2019, we managed to acquire low altitude mapping imagery along with elevation survey of only 5 of the terraces. Meteorological conditions prevented drone mapping missions for the rest of the terraces and for the rest of the year due to either high wind, rain, or high water. Sorry. The average settlement or decrease in elevation we captured on the 4 terraces for 6 months post-construction was right around 0.3 feet, and on the marsh terraces, 0.2 feet. If this is truly 30% of the primary consolidation, we would expect loss of just a foot in 10 years. It's kind of funny that it worked out to be 30, 0.3, 0.5, 0.9, and going with the percents, but that really is the average, the average tall settlement rate. We use the average settlement for these terraces to project performance of the rest of the terraces for the next 10 years. The subsidence rate for this area that was established by Nijnhuis, I don't know how to say that, Nijnhuis et al. In 2017 was 0.03 foot per year, and this was added or subtracted from the subsidence rate. The current global sea level rise of 0.16 foot per year from the IPCC was also added. You can already see the trend with terraces 4 and 8 at the top performing the best and marsh terraces on the bottom. To project the performance with sea level rise, with the projected sea level rise, the sea level worst and best case scenario is overlaid on this by the diverging blue lines. This was taken from numbers given from the IPCC. And the range for reality, of course, is indicated by the double arrow. Our normal water level is 1 foot, and I added that to this. I reduced the terrace profiles to the highest and lowest tall terraces and marsh terraces so that it wouldn't clutter up the graph too much. And of course, this doesn't include unpredictable storm impacts or fault movement, nor do we know if subsidence will remain steady or if all the ice in the world will melt at once. But anyway, this is using all the numbers I had handy to try to predict what our terraces would do. So where the terrace and sea level lines intersect is where the terraces are projected to fail by being submerged. With the best case scenario, the marsh terraces, the green lines at the bottom, of course being lower, are expected to disappear first somewhere between 2040 and 2045. T2 of the tall terraces, the taller one, the bold red line, performs the worst, disappearing around 2060. And T4, the purple line at the top, performs best, holding out to at least 2015. Thus, under the best case scenario, the taller terrace ridges persist 75 years longer than traditional marsh terraces that last the expected 20 years, and the taller structures function for 95 years. With the worst case scenario, the marsh terraces, again, the green line at the bottom, disappear first, somewhere between 2035 and 2040. T2 of the tall terraces, the red line, disappears around 2045. And the tallest terrace performs best, holding out at least to 2070. Thus, under the worst case scenario, the taller terrace ridges persist 30 years longer than traditional marsh terraces and function for 50 years. With reality likely somewhere between the two extremes, we still expect our tallest terraces to provide shelter and habitat for the next 50 to 95 years, which is 30 to 75 years longer than the expected lifespan of the marsh terraces. In planning for future projects to increase longevity, we must take rising water and subsiding land into account and overbuild where possible, or plan to rebuild to keep up with changing conditions. I can't really discuss costs with you because there's so many variables involved in that. So I'm just going to leave it there for now. Any questions?
Great, thank you, Karen. That was really wonderful. So we have some questions that were typed in early on by Dr. Mark Woodry over in Mississippi. And he is asking, when in the permitting or construction process do you conduct the geotechnical analysis? Do you have to excavate materials to conduct that geotech?
You need it for the permit. Let's see, in the permitting construction process. It's best to do it as early as you can because it's going to inform your design for what you're trying to do. And therefore you'll be more informed when you actually start the permitting process to know more of what, you know, how much you want to, if you want to end up with terraces that are 4 feet, you have to know how much higher you have to build them to try to keep them, you know, to have them result in 4 feet after they settle. So that would be probably one of the first things you do at the beginning, at the very beginning of design.
And then he also asked about the slope of the terraces. Is that based on engineering requirements, or are you just trying to mimic the slopes found in adjacent marshes? So what dictated the slope?
The slope could have been steeper. In fact, I had to work with the contractor and kept explaining to him what I wanted. They kept trying to build them steeper. If you build them too steep, of course, they might slump easier. But the 1 to 5 was just an easy one to use for design. And I don't think it really mimics the marsh because our marsh is flat. So what I was trying to do was provide a gentle ramp so that as water rose, the plants could move up with that water level with a more, and keep that wide marsh fringe. Hope that answers that.
Okay, great. Rob Smith with, I believe, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service asks, which additional tree species will be planted, and how have the ones that you have planted fared thus far?
Well, I like to keep the locals, and when we add extras, there will be natives. I would like to put some locust trees. That seems to be a favorite of some of the birds and wildlife in the area. Eventually we want to try things such as the red mulberry and some other shrubs and types of things when it starts to mature, to give the migrating birds more of a resource. As far as how our trees have fared thus far, it's been mixed so far, but some of them are still trying to bud out. We didn't have a lot of rain at the beginning, so I think they stayed dormant a lot longer. But so far it looks like about half and half. The oak trees and the hackberries are coming out, and I hope to see more as time goes on. I think there'll be more of them to bud out. We had a lot of leftovers that I actually took home and potted, so I have some to replace those where we've had too much mortality.
And I have a few mulberries in pots right now waiting to get transplanted to the terraces.
Our marshes are fairly fresh right now, so we may get away with putting things on the terraces that may or may not persist, but it would be really nice to diversify. Any other questions?
Hey, Karen, this is Bill Vermillion. Can you hear me?
Yes.
On the terraces that the Terns are using, are there contingency plans to potentially manage the vegetation down the road, you know, to keep those open areas, or y'all just kind of let them vegetate and let nature take its course, so to speak?
We plan to help it out as best we can. The taller terraces tend to stay less vegetated anyway, which is why we did not plant the trees on the ones that the Terns had selected before. So for at least a few years, I know that it'll be easy to knock the vegetation back. We were going to add shell, but as the terraces weather, a lot of that fossilized shell is sufficient. The Terns seem to find plenty of places to nest. I wish I had my notes. We counted about, I forget how many, maybe 18 nests already this year. Wish I had my notes. Or something like 42 least terns that we counted.
Any other questions? Either you can unmute yourself or type it into the chat box. I think that is a resounding no. You must have answered everybody's questions, Karen.
Wonderful.
Last comments by you?
I'm so excited to tell y'all about what we've done. I hope you appreciate it. I mean, as much as I do. I find it fascinating to make new land. I love seeing this stuff, and anything we can do to come up with new ideas. We need everything, every tool we can in our toolbox.
You have one more slide, Karen?
Oh God, thank you. Thank you, Eric.
Hint.
Yeah, hint. You're trying to hint loudly. We would like to thank those that made this possible. The most important slide of all. Wildlife Conservation Society provided the bulk of funding for construction and helped fund monitoring. The Walton Family Foundation funds helped fund the monitoring. Lamar Family Foundation assisted with construction funding and the purchase of plants. Pennies for the Planet funds, we've been holding on to those for a little while. They purchased most of the plants. Members of the Rainey Conservation Alliance provided various assistance throughout the project. I can't say enough. With information, access, personnel, the geotech report, all of that, it came through the Rainey Conservation Alliance. INCOS provided the water gauge and flow data throughout the project at no cost to us. That was wonderful data to have at hand. Resource Environmental Solutions was our marsh plant source and provided support during planting. And Vermilion Gator Farms provided personnel and boats for our volunteer event. And then I want to make sure that I thank all of our volunteers, and of course, anybody that I've missed. I thank you. I appreciate so much everything that everyone contributed. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing. So that's done.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I just typed the link of the project website into the chat box. And again, we'll follow up with some emails to make sure folks have access to that, especially once we're ready to post this webinar to that site. We will also have some additional photos of the project on the site, as well as sort of a short informational booklet about tall terrace designing. And probably in the coming weeks or soon thereafter, we'll have a final technical report that we'll add to the site as well. So thank you all so much. and have a great rest of your Thursday afternoon. Enjoy this beautiful weather and stay safe, everyone. Talk to you all soon. And thank you, Karen.
You're welcome. Thank y'all for coming in and listening.
Thanks, guys.